Innovation can happen at any age. That's why Total Retail's sister brand, Women in Retail Leadership Circle, has released its latest report, The New Next Gen, Women Who Have Transitioned Their Careers for Successful Second Acts. The impressive lineup of women featured in the report are reinventing, disrupting, and making an impact, all in their own different ways. Download your free copy of the New Next Gen report today at mytotalretail.com/resources.
Welcome to Total Retail Talks, your podcast channel for retail knowledge.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Total Retail Talks. I'm Joe Keenan, Editor-in-Chief of Total Retail. I am joined today by Jeff Berk, the Managing Director of Privé Porter. We're going to be discussing with Jeff today a little bit about Privé Porter's business model and kind of its success building the brand on Instagram and bringing that into a storefront this year. So thanks for joining me today, Jeff.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So let's get started by having you tell our audience a little bit about Privé Porter for those that might not be familiar with the business.
Sure. There's a growing category and genre of business called luxury resale. And arguably at the top of that genre is the handbag resale department. And I'd say as far back as probably early as 2009, there's kind of been a supernova level, a stratosphere to this of the Hermès Birkin collectible handbag world records. And that is the type of product that we're handling. We buy and sell very hard to get collectible handbags for the history and for the foreseeable future. The top three brands are Hermès, Hermès, and Hermès. And like the Rolex Daytona or many Patek Philippe's, certain Ferraris, also the Hermès Birkin, you just simply can't walk into an Hermès, no matter who you are, what level of affluence or celebrity status or political status. You can't just roll into Hermès and ask for one. There's a supply issue that we could talk about if you want to extrapolate. But just like the Rolex and just like these Patek Philippe's and just like those Ferraris that are limited edition, there's a super rich group that will pay whatever it takes. So if there's a bag that would normally retail at Hermès for, let's say, $12,000, and that's if you're lucky enough to be offered one, the Privé Porter customer is accustomed to buying that $12,000 bag somewhere between 18 and 22, depending on how hot the color is. And this is what we do. We buy and sell these with some of the biggest collectors in the world. Our reach is over 50 categories because we started on Instagram, and that is the top line of what Privé Porter has been doing.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating business model and business, and we're going to get into a little bit about the scarcity of the product and the luxury demand in a second. But just for context for our audience, why don't you tell us a little bit about personally, Jeff? Tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you ended up at Privé Porter.
In the spirit of self-deprecation, we started Privé Porter in 2008, and in self-deprecation, I spent the 10 years prior to that in really what I'd have to admit is the underbelly of super luxury. We were a position before Privé Porter. I was in a position where no matter if it's a $2,000, $20,000, $200,000 piece of jewelry from Graf, Roberto Coin, De Beers, Carrera, and another 15 to 25 other excellent couture brands, it is fashion, and these things come and go, and you can't dismantle a high piece of jewelry that's made of pave diamonds. And so what all these people needed was a profitable way to move all this excess inventory. However glamorous it was still inventory. And I had a reputation of being able to take this stuff and kind of make it disappear through private sales, trunk shows, super affluent designers going to their personal shoppers. And that's what I did from 2002 to 2008 or 9. And there's a category of brands that most people will remember if they don't exist, but still exist today, like Roberto Coin, Judith Ripka, John Hardy, David Yurman, and a few others. And in this time, by the time like 2007 came, my business was getting bigger and bigger. The amount of merchandise I had to move was getting bigger and bigger and challenging. And then in comes Kilt.com. And that was a godsend to me. I kind of forced my way to the table, and they would not have been able to build up that category of product, arguably, if it wasn't for my former firm, a financial firm called Accountable, making that available to them. And I had an intimate relationship to see the genesis of Gilt. They probably started, when I met them, there's probably only 6 or 7 people there. I saw their trajectory was ultimately going to arc back to the middle class, and I could explain that if you want me to extrapolate. And I kind of always knew in my gut that the super rich also wanted a deal, or they wanted to get stuff that other people didn't want. And I met a guy down here in Miami where I was based and still am, Lloyd Lapidus. He's the founder of Bag, Borrow, or Steal, which was a trailblazer at the time. You know, you could rent that $5,000 Fendi Python bag for a week for a few $100. You can't afford it. And he's the one who kind of instigated me to say, look, you've got the product. Supply chain is 80% of the battle. You should start your own Gilt and cater to the upper class. And that's kind of where Privé Porter started from. And I hate excuses, but we did try to start in 2008, 2009. There was a huge recession. I had no internet game plan. I had no history of clicks. I don't mind beating myself up by saying I bought pages in Town and Country and Harper's Bazaar, because that's what everybody in that category used to do. And it wasn't until around 2011 when my very clever and dynamic wife, Michelle, got involved. And that's when she identified handbags, and we could continue on that if you want.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, we will continue on that. I want to get into a little bit about, building the brand. And you talked about kind of the .com and the recession and then the impact, but and that moving, as we go up the timeline, we move into social and into those platforms that have developed and kind of growing the Privé Porter brand on Instagram. That's, really where the brand is engaging consumers. It's showcasing these, you mentioned that the supply chain is really the battle in terms of getting the product. You're showcasing the products that you have available for sale. Tell us a little bit about kind of how that has the impact that Instagram has had on the business and why it's the right platform for Privé Porter.
Some of the things I choose to say, I usually have a purpose, and I'll go back to calling Michelle creative and dynamic. Once she saw this, Heritage Auctions was really the only big player. They're the first ones to start setting these world records for, self-promotion, of course, but for these crocodile Hermès handbags. And there's a couple other women that are hobbyists that had websites, and they were somehow to get by and sell them. But Michelle just couldn't figure out how it was happening. And she kind of started noodling with this Birkin resale category. And it was hard, getting one bag at a time, asking friends for a bag. But what's my point? There was a time when, you can't even today, when you roll into Hermès and ask for a Birkin, they're not on the shelf. They're not available to everybody. There's a protocol and a song and dance that Hermès has that we could talk about later in the conversation if you choose. But my point is, if somebody was offering Michelle for sale an Hermès Lagoon, Lagoon, and Lagoon is really a French fancy way to say turquoise, okay? So back in 2011 and 2012, you couldn't just jump on the internet and Google Lagoon Birkin and see a whole bunch of them. So if there's nothing out there to see what a Lagoon Birkin should look like and be able to zoom in onto the leather and the shade of the color and stuff, she was backed into a corner. And then she realized, and certainly Instagram in 2012 is not a scintilla of what it is today.
Yeah.
But what she saw was the only place to see a Lagoon Birkin was just some super rich gal showing off to her community. Their community wasn't even a word then, that, hey, check out my new 35 centimeter Birkin Lagoon. So Michelle, if someone wants it, she wanted to see it, she started searching hashtag Lagoon Birkin, hashtag 35 centimeter Lagoon. You understand, let's call it a dozen great hashtags. And I went to Europe for some other organic business affairs. And we heard that the barrier for entry of getting great bags in Europe was a little easier. I went to about 7 cities, dropped about $250,000, and we came back with just a dynamic assortment of inventory, probably 5 or 6 Birkins, Kelly bags, things that are awesome that just never really reached mass populace, like the toolbox, CDC cuffs, but it was all in crocodile. So we had a lot of beautiful inventory.
Yeah.
And out of left field, she just says, look, I'm not putting this stuff on eBay, and I'm not going to make a website like those other chicks have. I'm going to do this on Instagram. I have a feeling if I put hashtag Sapphire Toolbox, hashtag 28 centimeter toolbox, hashtag Croc Toolbox Hermès, people are going to find it. And if I put at the top of the page my phone number and say, text me if you're interested, I think that's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And $50,000 a month turned into $70,000 a month, turned into $100,000 a month. And that's kind of how it started. And despite the fact that we've become synonymous, and I could explain that later, we've become synonymous with this VIP Hermès shopper at this point. With our notoriety and or our reputation and or certainly money that we have behind us, we would never be able to jump onto Instagram today with all those assets and make a dent. It was just my wife's weird gut instinct that was the horizon, and that no one's out there with these pictures. And what Instagram did, and I don't mean to go on and on, it gave an immediacy. Instead of going to a heritage auctions or goofing around with a website, doing it via text, this is a super demanding customer. And without that decision, we would not be here today.
Yeah, and you essentially got in on the ground floors, and we're a trailblazer in terms of growing the business on Instagram. As you mentioned, it wasn't a scintilla of what it is, the platform is today, but the reach was there. So you grew as its reach grew. So it was kind of you're taking those steps together, which is a great story of how you've built what you have today. I do want to touch on, you mentioned that kind of that inventory trip, and one of the differentiators for Privé Porter is its ability to acquire these items. They're in such high demand, but there's an extremely limited supply of them. The Hermès Birkin bags that you talk about. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the your company supply chain, and how you go about, without divulging, I guess, all of your secrets. How do you come upon this product and make it available?
I'll tell a couple. And going back to the beginning, and again, it wasn't like I needed a 10-minute lecture to Michelle about this, but in the beginning I said, look, I've been buying and selling these huge lots of the most beautiful watches and jewelry for years. The key to my success is I would buy everything that they had. I couldn't have someone else competing, but the key word is I was buying the merchandise, and I was paying the best price versus all the other people out there. And the handbag business was all built on consignment, including the auction houses to this very day. And I said, if you want to do this, we got to be buyers. You can't get into consigning bags, getting some lady to give us 3 bags to consign, because what you think you benefit for not having cash outlay, you got a headache of people blowing us up, bothering you all the time, arguing why it's not being sold. But more importantly, if you're buyers and everyone else is consigning, we're giving them an immediate financial solution. So that was probably the first step. And as we built up reputation as buyers, there's a whole bunch of people around the world that are resellers too, that to this very day that are just as capable of us. They just haven't had the same Instagram kind of, I hate to use the word fame. They didn't have the Kris Jenner, Paris Hilton, Cardi B moments that we have, that created this, afterlife in social media, but they're just as capable as we are. And I equate that to the So when all these people are getting bags, they're calling my wife first because we're kind of at the top of the chain. We were liquid. It's all our money. We could buy the best bags when we need to. We could pull the trigger on great product. So when other resellers can't afford to hold inventory and they want to make a quick flip, we're in a position to keep buying it. So we built ourselves up with the resellers around the world for stuff that they can't afford to inventory. It's coming to us.
Yeah.
And then lastly, in the last few years, and again, might be deficient in this conversation if we don't talk about the Hermès dynamic itself. But the current supply, I would say over 50% at this point, is now coming from those actual Hermès VIP customers themselves. They, in order to be offered that $12,000 leather bag or that $68,000, $92,000 crocodile, Kelly or Birkin, you have to be very, very invested. And if the store that you're accustomed going to, let's say in Chicago, and you're waiting for blue sapphire, that's a fancy word for electric blue. Okay. You're waiting for this blue sapphire crocodile. Once you get to month 12, 14, 20, month 22, and you're impatient, and they come to you with a different shade of blue, let's say cobalt, and they're like, hey, Joe, look, I know your wife wanted blue sapphire, but I got permission to offer you this crocodile blue cobalt. Joe or Joe's wife is really too afraid to say no at this point.
Yeah.
And it's just the way it is. They're too invested to say no. And these women, it could be Joe's wife, as a matter of fact, is probably calling us before she even goes back to the store to pick it up. And that conversation is, hey, look, they're really pushing me on this cobalt. I don't want to say no. Could I trade it to you? Do you have sapphire? Can you get sapphire? And at that point, like, yeah, buy the bag for 62, give us another 20, and we'll make it happen. Yeah. Or these people are just like, look, take it off my hands. I don't need to make profit. I just don't want to say no. And this is this is kind of the point that we are now. And I don't mean to go on, but if it's a bag that is not in our inventory that we have that someone asks of us, going back to that community of resellers, I correlate it to like being in the exotic car business. Joe, let's say you and me live in Chicago. Both of us are in the exotic car business. You've got Lambos and Porsches and Bentleys and Ferraris, and so do I. I know you exist, I exist. We want to succeed, we got to be friendly, right? And if someone walks into your store and she's dying to buy a white 458 Ferrari, and you know that I have one, we've got to have a relationship where you pick up the phone and say, hey, Jeff, look, Halle Berry's here. She wants the car. You got it. And of course, my answer is like, hell yeah, Joe, let's do it. What are we going to do? Split the profit? Let's do it. So that's the relationship we have with these resellers around the world. And that's my 5-minute answer to your very short question.
No, it's a great answer, and it's a fascinating one in terms of. And your last point there is, you've cultivated these relationships that if someone in the rare instances comes to you looking for a particular bag and you don't have that in inventory, you're able to go out and get it to fulfill that need. So a great point there. Just let's talk a little bit about the market in terms of luxury. We've talked specifically about Privé Porter to start, and we're going to get back into that. But in terms of the luxury goods market and how it's maybe have evolved over the last year, obviously the pandemic has influenced so much consumer behavior. What are the behavioral changes that you're seeing across the market? And then, maybe a second part to that is, has that impacted the behavior you've seen from the Privé Porter customer?
Before I talk about the Privé Porter customer, I'm going to comment that, and you could see it in the rebound in the economy. When everything started, I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up in New York City. I was a young professional, immediate adult in New York City I went from 2 roommates to 1 roommate, and I could finally afford no roommates. And when everything started, I had a heavy heart for people all over the country. Like, how are these people going to feed each other? And I was kind of wrong. The savings that people had turned out to be much better. Credit card delinquencies went down. And I think people have been, prepared for this. But once you start worrying about your fellow mankind, and I share that with the greatest honesty, this isn't, hyperbole for an interview. Then you start to say, well, gee whiz, what's going to happen to us? We're doing $1.5 million a month off our Instagram business. We had a plan to open 2 doors this year. Where's that going to go? And March and April turned out to be the biggest months that we've had in the 8 years that we've been in business.
Yeah.
And it was lit. This is going to come out as sarcastic or sensational, but it's quite sincere. People were calling us literally saying like, well, we're not going to Bali. We're not buying that Bentley. We're not buying that house in Big Sur. I got nothing to do. What do you have? Some of those VIP Hermès customers, the ones that don't sell to us, the ones that they bleed orange and brown, they would never stoop to a reseller. So lo and behold, a few weeks into that, we're getting calls from these people, cheekishly slumming it. Like, I would never really do this, but the Palo Alto store is closed and they promised me a bubblegum Matt Kroc, and I don't know if it's going to be there when they open up, and the super rich were doing something to entertain themselves because they had spare money. Yeah. But B, what I believe is more germane to this question and more important is this bag with great argument, if you don't beat the heck out of it, holds its value and or goes up in value. And the Privé Porter customer is really a woman that's got bag number 6, 7, 8, and she's looking for a certain color that she can't get, like an anemone, which is a shade of purple. They don't make it anymore. And she's got a collection. She knows in her head it's $600,000-$700,000, but they could afford to park the money there. And if something happens or they need to, get liquid, these bags can be sold no different than a Submariner could be sold. So that's really the experience that I've seen, and the very pleasant surprise that we've had for our business, that the pandemic, right or wrong about equality and spread of wealth, that's a whole separate conversation. The super affluent are just immune to this black swan type of activity.
Yeah, I think that's the 2 points that you bring up are really interesting, Jeff, in terms of the entertainment. They're not going on these trips, and people are hunkered down. They're hunkered down in some unbelievable homes, I would imagine. But they're the entertainment aspect. But to your point, that they're viewing these as not just a product, but it's really an investment. It's an asset for them that's not going to diminish in value over years. In fact, it increases in value over time. So that demand is still there, even if they're not able to, and this is a level of wealth. You said this is the super affluent that you're talking about here.
Yeah. What woman, on paper, it seems preposterous. What woman would willingly pay $22,000 for a bag that knows that it retails for 12? The woman, I'll tell you, the woman that could afford it. And number 2, the woman that knows when she walks out of my store with it, it's still worth $22,000. It's just because there's this market, kind of like how you get it. Probably I get it, even though it's not my thing. But there are many men and women, I guess mostly women, that look at a Barrett Jackson car auction and they just can't wrap their heads around the fact that some 1965 Mustang is worth $180,000. They just, what? That's an old car. It's not power steering. But what it is, there's a passionate community that buys and sells that car that sustains that $180,000 value. And as long as Hermès keeps doing a 10 or 12% price increase every year, and the women keep buying and selling these, and those 2 factors influence a constant growing secondary marketplace, there you have it. It's no different than the exotic car business.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So you mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about physical retail. So Privé Porter opened its first brick and mortar store this past year. Tell us a little bit about why a physical store was the right decision for Privé Porter. Why did it make sense? Tell us a little bit about the logic behind that. And then, forecasting ahead, do you see this becoming a greater physical footprint becoming part of the company's roadmap?
Well, I'm a business and news and finance geek and retail. You put retail into it. So, I'm reading 4 or 5 papers today, but you don't have to read 4 or 5 papers a day to not see the crazy blow up of resale, luxury resale, circular economy, et cetera, et cetera. This year, COVID be damned, there's probably about $200 million invested more into Rebag, Vestiaire Collective, Rent the Runway, another 7 or 8 of them. There's story after story about the Real Real's IPO. So to see that this is a category that people are on their DFG rounds of financing. Some of the names I've shared with you are not going to make it, by the way, and we could talk about that off the record. But everyone in private equity and venture capital is dying to get into resale. Brands themselves, they have to get back into resale. We could extrapolate on that if you want. But AP, or Audemars Piguet, is buying and selling their watches for 2 years. Richard Mille is now buying and selling their used watches. And that's because they're losing control of the brand. So for us, who has never had any debt, we're in the last 3 years, we've been kind of top lined at 18 million a year, because there's literally only so many hours my poor wife could take calls a day. Of all the 50 people offering me a bag today, which were the best? And all the 50 people want to buy a bag to me, which were the most real. So we're in a position where we're profitable, and there's many more bags out there that we can get. That you could ask me that question if you want. There's a bigger universe for us to immediately scale out. And so if I look at someone like a business called Watchfinder, which was bought by Richemont probably 15 months ago. They don't publicize the numbers, but my research puts, I'm going to guess, around 325 million. The last year of retail of revenue that Watchfinder did before being bought out was around 100 million. And for the listeners, so they don't have to put pause on the podcast and look it up, Watchfinder, they buy and sell used watches. Breitling, Tag Heuer, Patek, Rolex, all the way up the food chain. And that gives someone who can't afford a brand new $8,000 IWC to buy a used one that's warranted and stuff for $4,000. But what got Watchfinder, which was doing essentially what we were doing, up to that 100 million in revenue, is because they opened up doors number 3 and 4. Rebag, the crux of their money is opening 2 doors in New York. They opened 2 doors in Los Angeles, because they have to expand their footprint for people that are, for half a dozen reasons, just not going to shop online or offer their stuff to sell inbound online. So if the roadmap to be funded and eventually acquired had to be opening doors and increasing revenue, then it was obvious that it's something that we had to do as well. And I could sit here and keep talking about how synonymous we are with the Hermès resale business, and we are. But there's still a hell of a lot of people that don't know Privé Porter exists. There's a hell of a lot of people that came into our news store that admit, like, yeah, in 5 minutes, I bought a $24,000 bag. I always knew you guys existed, but it was just too weird for me to wire somebody $24,000 and hope it came and hope it was real, hope it wasn't scratched. So we knew if we want to go to grow in any scalable fashion, no pun intended, we had to really start looking at how do we open doors, number one, prove that it's not a mom and pop, that we could create incremental traffic, and we got a staff that could exist day in and day out without us, which we did. And we're on our way for doors number 2 and 3, probably before Q4.
So my follow-up to that, Jeff, is one, doors 2 and 3. Well, one, where's store 1 located, and 2, like 2 and 3, and kind of you as you look to grow in physical, identifying the markets that make the most sense for a store for Privé Porter. What are you kind of looking at in terms of demographics and maybe web traffic and some of the things that you're in consideration when you identify, like, we need a store in New York City, we need a store in Beverly Hills. Tell us a little bit about that process.
Thank you. Well, our first store is where I'm literally sitting now, in a pretty famous place called the Brickell City Center in downtown Miami, or this district is called Brickell. And my wife and I, live and work in the Boca Raton, Palm Beach County area. So Miami is a great market, and I'll tell you why. But Miami would have not have been in my top 5 if I was starting for the best market. But what Miami is here is because we have friends here, we have an apartment here. There's a proximity that made things easier. We've had to be in the store a lot more often than we wanted to. And I got really lucky unfortunately for COVID. But Brickell, what's great about Brickell, it's a beautiful outdoor area. And I'm literally next to Kiton, Kiton, very expensive men designer. I'm looking out the window now, I see Chopard. Next door to me, to my right, which just opened, is Lucid Motors, Lucid. They've got a 4,000 crazy showroom. Upstairs is Richard Mille and Audemars and Rolex, Chanel, every brand in Brickell Center that's not called Hermès. And where it was very difficult to get a community of this caliber, like Brickell City Center, run by Swire and Simon Properties, to consider a reseller into this, super luxe environment. Once they identified that we were going to concentrate just on Hermès, and I wasn't going to start selling Chanel double flaps and get Saks upset or Chanel upset. Once they saw that, that's a customer that's not coming here. The Hermès customer that's only going to the design district, maybe these Privé Porter guys could start pulling some new affluent people. They've showed us their numbers. The average customer spends $68,000 a year. Let's take a look at this. So I had to make a commitment that we were going to make a beautiful, luxurious environment that was equal, if not superior, to everybody else here, which we did. Another thing that worked in our way, the spot that I'm in used to be a Santoni shoe store, which is a super, super crazy expensive and very nice Italian men's footwear company. They kind of left in the middle of the night because of COVID. And so there was a hole to fill on arguably the 50-yard line, one of the best positions in the mall. Right across a beautiful restaurant called Casa Tua, which was doing $1 million a month before COVID. And a lot of the decorations and furnishings of the store went to our favor. So Brickell kind of pushed the envelope, got outside their comfort zone. They kind of had to, for financial reasons too.
Yeah.
Where is Saks going? What is Saks really even pulling anymore? And so far, so good. And we've been able to show that we can produce. We did $1 million in December, and that's organic. I don't think any of that is our core Instagram customer. People who didn't know us, or those people I referenced before, that it was too weird to wire us money and wait for the bag in the mail. So I think once we've proven that we could make it here, I'm hoping that once we identify cities number 2, 3, and 4, which I think I know what they're going to be, a lot of other communities which would have never entertained the idea of the real rebag, watchfinder, reselling. I think we've proven that we could exist because we are bringing in and catering to something that super rich Richard Mille Lucid customer wants.
Yeah. One thing we haven't touched on yet, Jeff, and I did want to talk about, is kind of the authentication process for the product. Obviously, counterfeit's a major concern when you're, consumers want to ensure that they're getting the authentic bag. Tell us a little bit about kind of the process that you go through with your company when you're buying inventory to ensure that you're getting the legit, stuff.
I don't want to let the professionals down and this, listening to this by diminishing what we do. But, my wife is the one who finds the bag, buys the bag, sells the bag, ships the bag. So I could sit here and say we've done $130 million to date, and that's pretty accurate. But the funny thing is, we've only touched and moved 4,500 bags. Okay. And it's still a lot of Hermès bags for a bag that allegedly doesn't exist. But the good part, if it's one gal touching more bags than 99.5% of Hermès employees themselves do, you get to see what's real and what's not. And in the beginning, we made every excuse. We made every mistake that anybody could have made. Someone sells you one real bag, someone sells you two real bags. They get you on the hook, get you excited for 6 at a time, nothing shows up. It's we've kissed many wart-laden frogs on the way to get here. But until Hermès, or who's the real culprit of where I'm going, until Chanel decides to get into the authentication business, they don't really have a right to sue or criticize everyone else doing their best to be in the Chanel authentication business. And where we are now is why we have the reputation is, unlike Rebag or the Real or anybody else, our niche, our customer is coming to us because she doesn't want to use bag. The bags are coming to us. Last year were what's hot, what's new, what are 2020 colors for Hermès, because we're getting the lion's share of these from these actual Hermès customers themselves who aren't crazy about the one they were offered. So the bags are coming with and being sold with the plastic on the hardware, the box, the paper inside the box, everything, every accoutrement that you would expect had you walked out the store with Hermès itself, including and getting to the point with the actual original receipt from Hermès itself. And sure, you could say like, well, man, if you can make a foolproof bag, why can't you make a foolproof receipt? But, once the name of the seller and her credit card data is redacted, it's still a receipt, which still shows the store and the time of day and the transaction number that blue glycine 30 centimeter was sold. So, once a woman is getting this, the authentication concern is a very limited, if not zero, conversation.
So my final question, Jeff, and I appreciate the time on today's episode, is you mentioned physical retail and potentially doors 2 and 3 and coming in Q4 later in this year. Where else is your attention focused as you look to continue to grow Privé Porter in 2021 and beyond?
Well, one of the things we're doing is we're going to, we've been self-financed and self-funded from the beginning. We've got at least 2 million in inventory, and that's just putting our profits back into product and back into the business. But we're starting our first seed round in probably about 3 weeks. And that's our target's probably between 4 and 5 million. And I'm getting to answer your question, we'll have a COO, VP of operations, director of marketing, directors, partners, shareholders. So it's going to be a consortium. Me and Michelle, we've done well, but we're still a mom and pop. We have great instincts to get us here, but it's going to be a consensual decision on where those first cities are.
Yeah. So, building that right team, as you noted, and kind of the first part of the answer. And then secondly, identifying those next stores, those next markets where you see a real opportunity for Privé Porter to thrive. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to take the opportunity to thank Jeff Berk, again, the managing director of Privé Porter, for joining us today on Total Retail Talks and telling us all about the business. It's really been a great conversation. I appreciate it, Jeff.
I'm honored. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for listening. For more information on this podcast, please check out our podcast channel page at mytotalretail.com/podcast for show notes. Total Retail Talks is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Make sure to subscribe on our podcast channel page as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a few moments to rate and review this podcast. Thanks, and until next time, this has been Total Retail Talks.
Meet the 21 women who have reinvented themselves and their careers after the age of 40 in Women in Retail Leadership Circle's newest report, The New Next Gen. Download your free copy today at mytotalretail.com/resources.